Hello. In episode 31 of Heirs for Architecture's second season, I speak with Jill Rudd and Torsten Schmiedeknecht about their co-edited volume, Building Children's Worlds, the representation of architecture and modernity in picture books, which they co-edited with Emma Hayward and published with Routledge this year.
The chapter that we have in the book, Jill and I, on Ladybird books, of course, and on modernity and modern architecture, Ladybird books, and we're looking at the period sort of between 1950, I think, roughly, and 75. A lot of the examples that we found were a promotion of modernity and, sort of reinforcing certain values. And to the opposite of that, the chapter by Maybauer on Jörg Müller and the Swiss illustrator sort of does the opposite. Yeah, so the modern architecture isn't necessarily seen there as a positive.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Jill Rudd and Torsten Schmiedeknecht. Torsten and Jill, thank you for joining me. Would you introduce yourselves, please?
Go ahead, Torsten.
Okay. Okay, I'm Torsten Schmiedeknecht. I am a reader in the School of Architecture at the University of Liverpool. And I used to be an architect. I've just left the ARB as of this year. So I qualified as an architect. I worked as an architect for quite some time, and then I became a full-time academic some 20 years ago.
Oh, right. But you continue to pay your subs, which is very, very generous of you.
I did until this year. So.
But you're a reader in architectural history, or?
No, I teach design and history and theory. So I've always taught, so in the 20 odd years that I've been there now, I've always taught design studio or was involved in studio. But I also give lecture courses. Currently, I've got a first year lecture course, which is really an introduction into what one might call building studies. So understanding buildings, but from a sort of formal perspective, really starting from very, very small buildings to, getting gradually bigger to relatively large buildings.
That's fantastic. What about you, Jill?
I'm in the English department at Liverpool on the literature side and have been there for far too long and have always been an academic. I haven't done anything more glamorous, unfortunately. And I have kind of a slightly weird portfolio of what you might call specialisms. So I teach and have done a wee bit of research into children's literature, but also now actually my main area would be medieval literature with a kind of eco-critical twist. So it's a sort
fantastic. Well, it's coming across these English scholars that always makes me feel rather mundane. I love the idea of doing medieval literature with an eco twist. So how did this? So we're talking today about this book that you published this year with Routledge, Building Children's Worlds: The Representation of Architecture and Modernity in Picture Books. And I suppose it would be nice to understand where the collaboration between you and the book is obviously also edited by our absent guest Emma Hayward. So how did this collaboration come about? How does an architect, an English scholar, and Emma is in architecture as well, is that right?
Well, Emma's Emma's the bridge in some ways, because she was in the English Liverpool department, but as a postgraduate did some work on literature in the city, really. And then, now, Torsten, you, of course, know this better than I do, because she was then working on the Reba exhibition. Is that right?
Not quite, no. So what happened was I'm just trying to remember now. So the original idea of working on anything like this goes probably almost 10 years back, not quite. My wife is also a lapsed architect. She's now a painter, but she used to do workshops, architecture workshops in primary schools mainly. And then she also worked on a project for a picture book, an architecture-themed picture book at some point. And I have always had an interest in the representation of architecture in print media, so that goes back quite a long time. But through Julia's work and my interest in the representation of architecture, but also having two children ourselves, the idea just came up to sort of have a look at how architecture is just simply how it's presented in picture books and what is presented to children. It sort of almost goes back a little bit further, because I'm obviously, I'm from Germany. I grew up in Germany, spent sort of half my life there. I grew up in a modern house that was built in the 1970s. And I was also trained partly in Germany, and were very much sort of then still in the sort of like the modernist or modern canon. And then when I came over here, so when our children were small, I noticed that the books that we got for them and picture books, that there were relatively little illustrations that contained or had modern architecture. And that was really sort of like the beginning of it all. So I then had the idea of maybe applying for a grant. So I went to my then head of department, Andrew Crompton, who said, "Oh, you've got to talk to Jill Rudd, because she's in the English department and she is teaching children's literature." And then I discussed the grant application with Jill, and then eventually in the second go got the grant from the RIBA. And then I said to Jill, "Well, now I've got the grant, but I need somebody to work with me. Do you know anyone?" And Jill said, "Yes, I've got exactly the person that you need," and that was Emma. And that's really how. So then on the back of that, Emma and I co-wrote a paper for the Journal of Architecture, and which is called Absent Architectures, which was published in 2019. And then I curated an exhibition based on the material that Emma had found, mainly in the British Library, really a survey of British children's books, award-winning children's books or picture books. So that was in also 2019. And then, I don't know, it must have been the year after that I thought, well, we can't stop here. So we had some findings that we could go into a bit more detail, perhaps, during the podcast. But then the idea came up, well, this obviously all looked at Britain. So can we expand, the research a little bit and have a broader scope? And that's when we started approaching people in other countries, mainly people who'd been involved in children's literature. So that was the sort of like the search for contributors, but also one former colleague from Liverpool who is an architect and who's in Colombia now, Carolina Rodriguez. So fantastic. That's the story of the book.
There we go. So it's quite, as these things are, slow gestation. And it's not even come out yet, actually, isn't it? It's coming out at the end of the month, which is very exciting to be doing this right now then. Jill, what was your particular interest in children's literature? Because and I want to get to this. I guess I want to understand also why you then chose to move specifically into thinking about picture books and our picture books literature.
Oh, okay, giving up on the video again. My interest in children's lit, again, it's a kind of long history of chance and bits and pieces.
Yeah.
I mean, anyway, I guess one of the things that tends to happen when you teach something like literature is that people always ask you, have you read this? Had you read the other? The thing that strikes me is that it's often what we encounter in childhood that not only, of course, has perhaps a longer effect, but also is sometimes the stuff we really remember. So you can read a book at much older than the ones we were looking at in terms of age that they're aimed at. But sort of, if you read something when you're 14, you're likely to remember it really well. If you read it at 12 even as well. And then also if you re-encounter books that you met when you were 5, you've got an affection for them. So a lot of that came up by chance. But then actually the beginning to look at it in a more academic setting came because the University of Liverpool used to have an education department doing a PGC and all of that, and for various reasons, back last century now, that closed. But we had the collection, and there were a couple of initiatives to sort of say, well, what should we do with this stuff? And so at that point, children's literature was just becoming respectable, if you like, as a kind of discipline within English literary studies. And I basically went across and had a look and said, well, you know, this, that, and the other, and don't lose this and hang on to the other. And just put together an undergraduate course simply out of interest. And then since then have been joined by another colleague who had been a school teacher and then had moved over into academics. And she and I still co-run that module. And it's changed over the years and it does different things. But your question about is it literature is quite interesting, because there's been a shift from thinking if we're going to talk about children's literature within a kind of literary kind of coterie, if you like, or an ambience, then it will be things for maybe the slightly older child, and it will be things that are considered also classic. Something like Kim might be it, or Treasure Island, maybe these things. But increasingly, people have got more and more interested in looking at the earlier stuff from a literary perspective, which is different from doing it from within education studies, it so happens. And then the answer to your question, you know, are picture books literature? Of course, some people would say, but hang on, if it's mainly pictures, what's literature got to do with it? But there's always been a tradition of the interplay between the written word and pictorial art of one kind and another. And picture books, particularly picture books for children, are maybe just the most long-lasting, if you like, of those examples. And so yeah, it's come about through that, really. So it's
and I assume that there has been an absence of this sort of contextualization of this subject within academic scholarship.
As far as I know, that article really that Emma and Torsten did was the first one that looked bang on, and very particularly architecture as such. So within children's lit in that way. There have been things where people talk about more broadly, perhaps, about a depiction, but it's very interesting. There's often a habit of assuming that it's going to be realist, that or it's fairy tale. You know, it's kind of the two extremes. And I think one of the things that was really interesting about doing this book was that, as Torsten described, it started really from a series of questions, you know, what if, and what is it like in other countries and other contexts, and modern architecture in particular. And that, as it happens, responds directly to a habit of saying that children's literature tends to be nostalgic, tends to want to make the world look very ideal. And so often if people are shown children with a house, the house in UK terms tends to be that kind of Victorian, Edwardian, sort of, as it were, typical house. And so doing this has really been interesting, because people from across the world have sort of said, well, here's an example of how modern architecture works in our place, and this is how it's received. And then also some of the chapters in the book also bring in children themselves to look at pages with pictures and text and give a response to it. So it's been really interesting, getting all of that stuff in.
Yes, I mean, when I saw this book, Routledge send around their newsletter, and I saw that this book was coming out. So I have children, and as you point you made, Jill, this re-encountering of books that I had read to me, which is now what I'm doing to my own children, and I'm going through all of the same ones. So this is kind of, but with some deviations along the way. And I've got quite a large number of children, so I've had to read them twice, because the first lot got the books, and then I got to read them again for the second lot. And so it's books like Emil and the Detective and Stig of the Dump. And actually and it was because I'd just given a lecture in which I had been introducing the course to our third years, when I saw this book, and you know, we always do this very worthy thing in architecture school where we tell students about books that they should read, which they will never read. So I decided I would skew this idea, and I would tell them to read Emile and the Detectives, because for me, it's one of the best books about people in cities. It's an extraordinary idea of a book that, you know, of space and time and really, really kind of characterizing a modern environment and all of the kind of Emile going to the city and meeting modernity. So I really loved this about your book. But I think, so what I really wanted to understand at first really was this idea of modernity, this peculiar shift that you're seeing in a kind of transnational context in terms of your author. And this idea that children's literature is used as a device for socialization, socializing children to a new reality that had emerged. And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit. Is this something that has a kind of heritage to it? Is this what children's literature has historically intended? And
yeah, I mean, I think the very earliest children's books, or one by which I mean books that are aimed at children, as opposed to books that are out there and that children are known to have encountered, tend to be ones that explain the world to children. So there's Comenius, Orbis Pictorialis. It's a kind of picture book, and it is teaching you how to read. It's quite fun. It's got all sorts of information in there. But it deliberately uses pictures alongside. And with those, some of it seems very neutral. So it will tell you how to pronounce the letter A by actually, they do it by the sound of the animal. So it's represented by a crow because a crow goes, ah, ah, kind of thing. But there's also information of other things in there. So it will tell you, it's often giving you an idea about how you should behave. It tells you what the order of society is. And of course, there's no question offered to the child. It's like, this is how it is. So from that point of view, yeah, that heritage is very long indeed, that you assume that the book is somehow either telling the child what the world is like or what it perhaps could or should be like. How much the authors necessarily do that deliberately is maybe more open to question. So something like Emile and the Detective, you've got something where, yes, we're in a modern city. How much it is also deliberately telling you, and this is what a city should be like, that it should be a modern place, that this is a place of adventure, but also danger. That's open maybe to debate, if you see what I mean.
If I just may add to that, when Emma and I did the paper, we interviewed some of the illustrators of the books that we'd found, and some of them, it was quite interesting. They basically said, and I remember a couple, like I won't name them, but in particular, they said, well, what we draw, or what we, the images that we produce are also very much to do with the surroundings that we grew up in. So it's less ideological, perhaps, as one might think, but more, these are my personal experiences, so therefore that's the world that I draw. And in the process of the research, so that was one, and this was referring to what, modern architecture or ideas of modern architecture. But of course, everybody knows, Raymond Briggs and the Snowman, and of course the Father Christmas. And I wasn't that, because I didn't grow up with Briggs. But then, of course, we had Father Christmas, when our children were small. And apparently, what Briggs sort of, he always went back in his images to the world, well, basically the street that he'd grown up in, hadn't he? So again, and those were just his experiences. And then there was a third thing, which was which we came across, which was simply in Britain, for instance, and Briggs would qualify as one of them, the age of the illustrators or the time when they were born. So that when they grew up, that there was perhaps relatively little modern or modernist architecture around them. But to come back to your initial question, I think the question of modernity or the power of pictures, I think it's more the latter, and I think it's perhaps less to do with what era you're looking at. But I mean, I think a couple of our authors have really hinted at that how powerful images are, and what role buildings or architecture can play within the narratives of picture books, and I think that's and that's regardless, of course, of whether that's modern architecture or traditional architecture. But there is, and I must say, before we started all this, and even before the book, that hadn't quite clicked for me really, the incredible power of. I think at one point Emma and I said, well, the picture books are obviously, it's almost sort of like the first, or it used to be, now it might be a tablet, or a phone, you don't know. But they used to be the sort of first visual media that children are confronted with, through which they are confronted with stories. So I think well, there's a lot of research obviously on children's literature, but on this particular thing of how let's say the built environment in broader terms is used to construct narratives to support either positive or negative stories and so on. It's I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And I wanted to add also, because you said was this a sort of like a new thing? I wish I could say yes, but it's not quite, because two of our authors in particular, Mani Campagnaro and Jörg Maybauer, we weren't quite aware of that, but I think they had written things not much earlier than us, but they were there before, basically, and started looking into precisely the same thing, picture books and their value.
So that's very fascinating. The thing that I suppose thinking about is that modern architecture was a project which was very hierarchical in its coordination. It was very much a thing that was done to people. It was good for them. And the way that we've taught architecture off the back of modernity has paralleled that, where we've taught architecture as something that is handed down with heroes and things like that. So I was assuming that as modernist literature, these children's picture books likewise had that kind of agenda of being an improving device, that just as the architecture that they were picturing was about social change, because you talk about that, these are sort of images that challenge social and cultural values. They're deployed. You talked about them being deployed. So I think I was just wondering if there was some kind of evident parallel, like if you're drawing modernist architecture, and modernist architecture is in a way a living actor within the story of the book. It becomes more than just a backdrop, but actually becomes a dynamic within it. And I think that's why Emile and the Detective, without wishing to bang on about that book too much, is kind of interesting, because it's the city is like, modernity is exciting. I think that's probably the best, the principal characteristic of modernity is it's really exciting, and Emile goes to the city and it's really exciting. So I was just wondering whether, I guess that's where my question was coming from, this idea that, the improving project of modernity in architecture is paralleled by the improving project of modernity in picture books.
Well, you see so when we initially, so again, that goes back to the paper with Emma and to the exhibition. We really struggled finding, in those award-winning books from the UK, we did struggle to find images of modern architecture, and then we struggled to find images that were either doing what you're describing or that were neutral. And in quite a lot of cases, there was at least a sort of like an underlying tendency that modern architecture was used to maybe reinforce other narratives, so not necessarily positive. And I'd say in the images that we got for the exhibition, it was probably about 50-50 from memory. And that was where then the idea came, well, how is it in other countries? So we had in the exhibition, there was a section that started the exhibition that was called The Old World, and that had things like, Briggs and various others. And as Jill said initially, the reverting to the sort of, sorry, it's podcast, the pitched roof, basically. Yeah. And the sort of well, it was really sort of like Victorian Georgian ideals, and then often particularly with high-rise buildings, the narrative was not always switching. Then at the end of the exhibition there was a whole section on high-rise buildings, and there were quite a few that were used definitely not in a positive sense, maybe not outright negative. But interestingly enough, so the chapter that we have in the book, Jill and I, on Ladybird books, of course, and on modernity and modern architecture, Ladybird books, and we're looking at the period sort of between 1950, I think, roughly, and 75. So a lot of the examples that we found were, that was a sort of like really a promotion of modernity and, sort of reinforcing certain values. And to the opposite of that, and I think you mentioned that in the email that you sent us, the chapter by Maybauer on Jörg Müller and the Swiss illustrator, sort of does the opposite. Yeah, so the modern architecture isn't necessarily seen there as a positive thing. And what's interesting about that, though, is of course my personal experiences for picture books in Germany would sort of contradict that, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So the example in Maybauer's chapter is maybe not necessarily typical for Germany or Switzerland, and the same is for our chapter, where it's not necessarily typical for the UK. But across the board, then there are differences. So we've got a chapter that looks at Singapore and Australia, for instance, and China, where it's taken into account that. I think the conclusion of these chapters is that they're much more comfortable both with the past and the present and the future. So the past is sort of like being used to positively project into the future, but they haven't got a problem with modernity as such. So that's one of the examples, or the chapter on Sweden, and perhaps the one on Italy. Sort of they fall into that category, but some of the other chapters don't necessarily. The examples of the pictures that they chose, or the books they chose, are not necessarily sort of modern or high modern, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting when you mentioned your paper on your chapter on Ladybird books, which I also used to teach my eldest daughter how to read, which is hilarious because you can still get them. They've not been updated one bit. Peter and Jane still have a dog, and the dog still chases a ball, and it's all very nice. But I was wondering whether there was something in this as well about they're very austere, and a lot of these interiors are very austere. There's not much in them. I mean, I try and persuade my children around Christmas time that what Rupert the bear gets for Christmas is probably all they deserve, which is, a ball and a bat. And it would save me a fortune if we could go back to that rather than mounds and mounds of plastic that they have to get. But I wonder if there is anything in that as well, that this particularly in this post-war period, there's a sort of aspect of citizenship included in the way that these books are describing reality, which is about controlling appetites, controlling expectations, and corralling values towards a new civilization, new society.
Do you mean the Ladybird books in particular?
Well, no, just generally speaking. I mean, it's not an aesthetic that's gone away. I mean, I was thinking about Anthony Brown, the author, children's writer Anthony Brown, whose books also have this very austere, I mean, very bleak, his books are, and we perhaps can come to him later. But there is all the way through that period of post-war literature, it is, as far as I can see, like kids playing in dustbins and in dumps and stuff like that. It's very austere.
Possibly. I mean, I think there's quite a lot mixed up in there. I mean, so for example, the Ladybird series, just to come back to what you were saying there, they did actually update the pictures to an extent in the 70s so that the children's what they're wearing becomes, inverted commas, more modern in that, to the 1970s. And I wonder how much a publisher, when updating something that is counting as a classic, will go so far but no further, because you don't want to alienate the adults who are doing the buying of the books to make it into something that is so very different that they won't go near it. But you might well be right. It's interesting that you call it austere, and I think in a way, for some people, in fact, that simplicity is part of what they want to think childhood is like. And in a way, therefore, it's quite surprising that something like a modern architecture and a modern art interior, or a modernist interior perhaps, doesn't also appeal, because that ought to pick up on that kind of idea of, clean, no clutter, all of that kind of stuff. But I think, and again, this is very country specific. In the UK, there is a long tradition of kind of an idea that your childhood home will have bits and pieces from previous generations, and that might also include actual members of the previous generations as well being still there in one way and another. And so you get that kind of reluctance to have something that is without anything that looks Victorian, Edwardian, or old in inverted commas, or whatever it would be. So I don't know whether that's playing in there. But there is something also, perhaps, when we're talking about very young books for very young, about the virtue of a page and a picture that is not over cluttered. And this then also actually fights against other things. So something like the Where's Wally lot, it's deliberately very, very busy, because it's supposed to be a game, of course, to find Wally in his striped t-shirt and all of this kind of thing. So it's quite tricky in a way to find something you can say is a universal truth across all of this type of thing. But you can detect these little trends, or you can wonder at some of these absences and sort of think, well, if such and such a thing is being updated, why is it not everything, as you're saying, that's being updated,
Yeah, I mean, that's funnily enough, that's quite a timely discussion because of the recent brouhaha over the updating of Roald Dahl's book, which illustrated by Quentin Blake.
Yeah.
Very spiky.
Very spiky.
Very, like, drawings that correlated with his texts in very, very direct ways. There's a kind of there's no anger or no bitterness within his drawings, but certainly made sense of his texts. It's interesting.
Yes, and became Blake, of course, illustrated other writers as well. But yes, it's one of those great pairings, which happens in children's literature. Most people, Alice in Wonderland, it's going to be Tenniel. Alice has been illustrated by many others, but that's still kind of the classic. But you're right. The thing there is, of course, that for one thing, it was then reversed, because interestingly, immediately you had older generations saying, but you can't mess with this. And so now the publisher are producing Roald Dahl Classic and the new revised one.
Brilliant. Capitalism wins every time.
It does. And it's only very specific terms that have been changed. Nothing else has been changed. And that's a kind of, if you like, a sensitivity to language.
Yeah.
Can I so because I was surprised when you the term austere. So the books that we looked at, I mean, we had a relatively small sample, and a lot of them were from the People at Work series, for instance. And so I think there's a sort of it's a weird mixture of them. I mean, I never saw them as austere, funnily enough, but sort of a lot of them I thought were quite and that's, I don't think that's to do with my sort of modernist background, which is shifting anyway, but I thought they were sort of like quite jolly, and they sort of it was the tidiness of the pictures that sort of surprised us. And so we had, for instance, if you look at images from a building site, and it's, you know, I mean, that's not what building sites look like.
No.
And certainly not what they looked like in the 60s, you know. And it was, you know, we sort of observed, even though of course you can't really, well, you cannot draw noise to a certain extent, but you know, even if it was noisy environments, it was all what's the word? Yeah,
It always
tidy,
seemed very calm.
Calm, yeah, and a bit what's the word? I can't think of the English word now, but well, anything that was kind of like perhaps negative, i.e. the you know, the noise of a building site, or the weather, or that it was cold, you know, that's kind of, that's blanked, that doesn't exist, you know. Even in a factory, and everybody's happy, and on top of that, of course, everybody was everybody in a responsible role, usually, unless if it was to do with bringing up children, was male, and white, of course, you know. But that's maybe a different discussion. But I think that goes together with the whole, yeah, the representation of certain, well, in this particular case, worlds of work, you know. So
yeah, it's
that's why we call it, it's a utopia, really.
Yeah.
Well, for certain people, you know, not one that we would probably aspire to, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a kind of benign omission of anything else, you know. It's sort of, everybody knows that children create as much chaos as they perhaps like, maybe, and that, as you say, building sites are not places where everything is always desperately tidy, and actually, you know, neither are schools and all of that, but in these worlds, yes, they are presented as such. And it's interesting, if you look through the book, quite often there's Munari's chairs for children. They're very funny, they're very witty, but when you see them in the book, they're also designed, of course, to be stacked, or you see them carefully positioned in the picture. So you get that kind of lack of random clutter, I guess, would be a way of thinking about it.
So is it something to do with, I don't know, you're right, I think you're right. It is more to do, there's a couple of things that just jumped out at me. Like, I often try and see the world through the eyes of my children, because it's the only way I can get through to them sometimes. But I wonder if there's been sort of work done by psychologists about the way that children observe and perceive space, and that the effective drawing in or the author illustrators in these books are actually reflecting on a characteristic of childhood, which is that you see what you need to see. And actually it doesn't seem cluttered. It just seems like a big wide world when you're a tiny person or a smaller person. I wonder if there is a kind of psychological angle to what these authors are playing at, which is about kind of articulating the child's perspective, because that lends it the voice of authenticity.
Well, a couple of the chapters are quite interesting on whether the images are, and there aren't all that many that do this, but how far they are deliberately presenting something from a child's eye perspective, or they put a child into the picture. There's occasionally with a lion or whatever, you know, there's a sort of question there, but again, the temptation to generalize, it will always come a cropper, I think, because there's the debate, for example, about what the relation between the picture and the written text is. Is the illustrator only illustrating, as in they look at the text and they say, I will put into this picture only what is in the text? Or are they adding something else? Or is there a deliberate extra story that goes on through those images that is not present in the written word? So depending on who the illustrator is, and how they consider their role, but also maybe what they think the book is doing, depending on that, you get a different type of picture.
Really interesting.
No, absolutely. No, I think I was just thinking before, we had there's one illustrator that I really like, and I don't even know why. She's called Sarah Garland, and we had a few images of her in the exhibition. And what I liked about her illustrations was that they were they were under the sort of heading of the everyday. They're basically not photorealistic drawings, but they're sort of, they are drawings of the world as you and I would probably see it, and there are modern buildings, but they're not threatening. There's like one of a street scene with a modern apartment block in the middle of the street, and which has some shops on the ground floor. There's one with some modern terraces, which would look probably like built in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
But they're drawn, so they're not drawn from a child's perspective, but they're just drawn, probably as you would sketch a building as a tutor or something, more or less, to illustrate it. And then again, you have other people, as Jill said, where the images are a lot more abstract, or they're drawn from different angles. And I think, well, maybe it's also because I don't know anything about the psychology behind it, but there's such a variety of illustrators around, I think, and of course the illustrators are often they might not have studied illustration, but they're certainly artists, and every artist comes with their own baggage, with their own, and I think that would be sort of underestimating the artistic process really of and the process of drawing. And
Yeah.
I can only guess, and again, that would be probably subject to doing probably 100 interviews with different illustrators, that it's a lot of it is probably very subjective.
I think also, just coming back to what you said earlier, Torsten, there is often a degree in which the illustrator will bring in something from their own childhood. Perhaps because it echoes in their mind whatever the tone of the text is. And there are also things that are default. So if you want a creepy house, or if you want a sense of danger, then there are kind of culturally available templates, if you like, and an illustrator will make greater or less use of them, depending again on what they want the picture in the book to be doing. It's really interesting. I mean, you can see there's loads and loads of different avenues of further discussion and research that could be followed up here.
I mean, I was thinking about austerity. Sorry to go back to that. And I've always read The Tiger Who Came to Tea as a story of austerity. It's like a story a mother and father tell to a child about why they've got nothing in the house. But anyway, that's just, and so she constructs a fantasy which the child believes, and the father comes home and it's payday or whatever, and he takes them out for ice cream. And that's the way I've always played it. But
see, that's quite interesting, because there is that kind of tradition also will give you the idea that it's a kind of fantasy, and are you actually with the child in The Tiger Who Came to Tea, and it's the mother who is that tiger real? Has the child made it up, and the mother is partaking in that, and the father, he's not part of the domestic world. No. And that's if you again, that isn't a book that was discussed here, but again, that's touching on some of the things that Torsten was mentioning earlier, where you've got the gender roles are unquestioned. The interior of the house there is actually middle class affluent, really. You've got a fridge that works, the kitchen is quite big, you've got what is clearly quite a pleasant house to be in, but it's not a very modern one. It's that default UK ideal of a sort of Edwardian or late Victorian or something like that. I mean, it's not, you don't really know what the whole house looks like. All you get are certain rooms within it. And again, your point about it being uncluttered, but you want it to be, because the picture has to accommodate a tiger. It's how much is it that? And you could say that there's a richness there, that it's a richness of imagination. And where has the tiger come from? And is it a toy tiger that here is become a big tiger? Is it a real tiger? All of that kind of thing. And the book allows you to go that way, as well as doing what you're doing, which is saying, but actually there's not that much perhaps to offer. I mean, the tiger's eating absolutely everything. Why is there no food in the house? Because the tiger ate it, But it's interesting that you have that happy ending, and it kind of, the fold out of the book then takes you into kind of, we'll go off and, as you say, we'll have ice cream for tea. And that's again a very quite a common trajectory within children's picture books, early books, that whatever it is that happens, it will end actually not infrequently with tea, with a meal, with food, with the family all there.
Yeah.
And that idea of homeliness, actually, which comes up even in the chapters that we've got, where they're not necessarily dealing with that explicitly. It's quite interesting how much that comes up as another motif. That what makes something homely, what makes something warm, what makes something welcoming.
Is there a distinction in the literature that you've seen between the exterior, the city, the urban realm, and the interior, this exteriority, interiority, which is a condition of the contemporary as well, isn't it? Of modern architecture. Do you see a distinction where the city is presented as modern, but the home is always kind of not, again, generalizations aside, is there a kind of general tendency towards this idea of home and hearth and family, interior, but outside we've got a world that's changing, it's moving, it's becoming universalized and so on?
Yes, I think there are some examples in the book. So again, the chapter on Australia, Singapore, and China is one example.
Yeah.
And
by Sabine Tan.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I was just thinking Monari is slightly different, because that was interesting, because that had some interesting explorations of the interior, but they were modern, so not necessarily that. I'm just trying to think now whether there was another one where it was explicitly where that difference was. So I think that chapter, by Sabine and Kay and the others, is probably the main one, I would imagine. Yeah, perhaps the one on Colombia from memory as well. Yeah, I'm just going through them in my head now, because the French chapter is really more about generally about domestic space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was interested in this idea of the globalization of modernity. As well, the way that this genre. So one of the things that I've been noticing is the popping up of ideas of genre within what you're talking about. But I don't think genre was something that you dealt with specifically in this. But you've mentioned ideas of fantasy. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about are fit within a kind of realist kind of thing, I suppose, aren't they?
Yes.
Was there any? I mean, obviously that was an editorial decision, I assume. No,
not really, because we were much more interested in leaving the remit, if you like, as open as possible, because it was for us an open question. Sort of, what actually is it like from one country to another? And so it was a much more kind of simple, we'd be interested if you would like to do something that is looking at modern architecture in children's picture books, and we left it at that. And perhaps it's not surprising, perhaps it's something that conclusions could be drawn to say we've ended up with stuff that by and large, but not exclusively, is realist. But then you have someone talking about the Casey Court cartoons, Lashine's doing that, and there's maybe elements of whimsy, you might say, that perhaps come in within maybe a realist background. So that's true of when you're looking at the Colombian, when you're looking at what's going on in Singapore, But there was no steer from us to say, by the way, we're really focusing on realist at all.
No. That's really interesting. But it does, sort of, to me, seems to naturally follow into the next thing, which is this idea of the critique of modernity that starts to come into some of these. And I mentioned Anthony Browne earlier, and his books are fabulous. But by God, are they bleak? They again, seem to me to be riddled with ideas of austerity, and he's obviously relatively contemporary, if not contemporary. But compared to, say, someone like Shirley Hughes's work, which is you know, they're delightful books. They're remorselessly joyful, which is probably a good thing. Whereas Anthony Brown and people like him, and I've always felt this about E. Nesbit as well as an author, a children's author, they're writing over the heads of the children. Almost they're writing to the parents who are reading the books. I don't know.
Yeah, you see, the literature person in me would say that is a mistake to think that, because I think one of the things that when you come in, you forget when you're an adult and you look at this and go, my goodness, that's a long word. That's a very complicated idea, whatever it would be. But we encountered it when we were whatever age, 7, 8. We understood what was going on. So I think we all too quickly forget that actually things that seem to be above the head of the child reader might not be, or might be there for that child reader when they're a little bit older. And I would say that arguably that's true of the illustrations as well.
I would agree with that, actually. I think some of it, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Anthony Brown and Shirley Hughes, because I mean, they're obviously at the opposite end of the spectrum, so Shirley Hughes is probably one of the authors that would have prompted us as well, you know, to say, well, you know, how does it work in other countries? And Brown, of course, was one of the exceptions here, even though I think his stuff is sort of surreal almost, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of austere, but it's it's challenging. But I think, you know, and again, you know, I mean, I suppose, you know, children will interpret it in different ways. But the one thing that I think, to me at least, is important in all this, you know, no matter what you're exposed to, but to come back to the sort of like the power of images generally, is I think it's probably habit, you know. So if you're being read Father Christmas X amount of times, you know, and you know, I mean, with your children, it's probably the same, that you read the same book. And we had a book called what was it called? Jackie's Trip to the Moon, and I think my wife probably read that hundreds of times to our son, you know, absolutely. And you don't quite know what really, you know, but he's got a relatively, I'd say he's got a relatively contemporary taste. And at the same time, I mean, and I'm sort of going slightly off, not off topic, but it's very interesting, and I'd be interested just to hear your view on this. So in my first year lecture course, I show a lot of contemporary architecture, well, contemporary meaning, you know, from the last sort of 50 years, let's say. There's quite a lot of concrete still, even though I probably have to change that. And the students, by and large, I think they enjoy, you know, having buildings explained to them, but they do not enjoy the, so I showed quite a lot of Swiss architecture from the 60s and 70s. And they don't really like this kind of stuff, not in first semester, first year. And I'm absolutely convinced, you know, and at least, you know, 10 years ago, if you go back, you know, when they're in third year and fifth year, that's the kind of stuff that they would be designing, you know. I mean, that goes into a sort of slightly different bracket of, you know, what architecture school does and so on. But because a lot of students grow up either in terraces or in semi-detached houses in you know, suburban environments, and probably have read more Father Christmas than Anthony Brown, their expectations and their comfort zone is a completely different one to, say, the one that I had when I grew up, because I was surrounded by modern architecture pretty much non-stop. It was where I grew up, the exception was, you know, 19th century buildings, for instance. And that, of course, you know, I can't deny that somehow formed at least, you know, my initial taste or my willingness to engage when I was in first year. You know, of course, that's what we do. We do modern architecture. What else should we do? So it's really, I think, the force of habit shouldn't be underestimated, and that's, of course, then where children's books can become incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Strange, isn't it, that you would? Yeah, I see what you mean. I was just thinking as you were talking about, yeah, Robin Hood Gardens in London, which was obviously knocked down. Perfect modernist estate. I still imagine the children in there when they drew pictures of houses do little pitch roof things with a chimney to the side and a door and a rose around it.
It's quite interesting. Well, I think Robin Hood Gardens, again, well, I'll say it. I've got the opportunity now. I really like modern architecture, but I really think that was a terrible scheme, start to finish. That was really bad. But anyway, but it's an interesting point that you're making, yes. That perhaps,
There's sort of, perhaps there's deeper rooted cultural models or forms, like a Platonic form of what house is, depending on context. I mean, that obviously doesn't, it's probably an appalling theory, but I do wonder about that, whether, because you're absolutely right. I was talking to Bob Brown, who's an external examiner at our architecture school. He's at Portsmouth, Professor Bob Brown, and we were talking one time, and he was talking about how in architecture school, he's done research around this. Most students come in with a kind of, what you might say is a normative idea of what architecture is, based around predominantly where they've lived. But by this halfway through second year, I think it was that he said, halfway through second year, they've flipped and they've started to embrace modernist ideas. And so this is where these initial questions around socialization comes from, is and instrumentalization. Is like, was there a project here? Was this more coordinated? Was this more about creating a globalized citizen, a kind of modern citizen, in a post-war context in which things were all being reconstructed around new, cleaner lines, clearer sight line, talking just sort of socially, so, a less kind of Rococo social structure, a less kind of Baroque urban language, and so on and so forth. And maybe, and your book doesn't address this, I guess, but there was also a kind of, we need to clean out the kind of imaginations of our young, so that this brave new world, this future, is accepted.
I think in architecture school, yes, as you know, probably as Bob said as well. But in I didn't. I mean, I don't. What Jill will probably agree. I don't think we found this sort of bigger global project in this context. I mean, probably rather the opposite. No, we can't say that, but I don't think. No, because again, I suppose it's partly to do also with the fact that, of course, illustrators illustrate all sorts of things. So you might draw a book that has no architecture in it, or no, that takes place in the forest or whatever. So it's kind of. It's interesting that you mentioned Anthony Brown, because most of his books, at least most of the ones that I know, they deal explicitly with buildings, don't they? Or I mean, there were a lot of buildings in his books, but he's probably more of an exception, I would think.
Just the last thing, I'm kind of, I would love to talk more about this idea, this shift, as we've become more ambivalent about the modern project. The literature around it has either become more like, more children's literature. The presentation of the modern city has become less and less joyful, less and less hopeful, positive, exciting, and more to do with the kind of, I mean, a lot of the graphic novels and a lot of the kind of fantasy work that's done now is based around an idea of this epoch ending in catastrophe, and there being a survival within it. And the modern architecture takes on this kind of role of both a reminder of our hubris and our wickedness, but also a space of adventure. And I wondered if there was, if that had been a trajectory that was noticeable within the book as well, whether that, I mean, that's just my interpretation, by the way, it's not like Bible truth or anything like that. Is there a kind of, again, it will be contextual, I suppose, but is there a kind of deconstruction of the hopefulness that you see in early depictions of modernity?
I would say no. I'm not in the book, I don't think. But that's probably also partly to do with the sort of scarcity of the material, but I think there are other things that are now, and again, we only touch upon that in the book marginally, but I think another thing really to look at, or another project would be to see how architecture is used, and Emma does this, for instance, or how architecture comes into play for questions of diversity, for instance. So, as society is changing, and I don't think there's been much research into that, to see how picture books dealing, with very contemporary questions, diversity, gender, and so on, and perhaps how architecture has been employed there. And that's, we haven't really done that apart from perhaps Emma's chapter. But I think so, and well, in a way that can only be positive again. So I think so. I know that doesn't answer your question, but
No.
I don't think that we've seen a sort of there were some books in the as you were asking the question, I was just thinking, I can't remember the name of the book now, but that was really quite a sort of dystopian picture book. It was about a city that was built, and then there was a catastrophe, and I mean, it was the images were like, it was all very dark, and but again, that to come back to what Jill said, there's an enormous variety and diversity. So it's I don't think you can ever say, there's, picture books go into one direction, or
no.
So for every Anthony Brown, there'll always be a Shirley Hughes. I think.
Is that a good thing? Yeah, that is a good thing, I suppose, that natural diversity within it. Well, thank you very much for joining me. I've enjoyed speaking and listening to you very much, Torsten and Jill.
Thank you very much. Thanks for giving us the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks.
First brutalist housing estate to the right and straight on till morning. Magical stuff, was it not? Thanks to Torsten and Jill for the discussion, and to them and Routledge for the book. See the podcast description for links to it, Torsten and Jill's professional and social profiles. And thanks for listening. Cheers.